I was never one to believe in love at first sight, much less in online relationships. But everything changed when I met Ethan. It was an ordinary night, nothing special, and I was browsing the internet, just passing the time. That's when I came across his profile. Something about him caught my attention immediately. Maybe it was the way he expressed himself, so charismatic and engaging. I decided to take a chance and sent him a message. What started as a casual conversation quickly evolved into hours of sharing confidences and laughter. I, Sarah Thompson, have always been an independent woman, accustomed to the quiet routine of my life in the small village in rural Florida. I had been living alone for years since my parents passed away. Despite a few previous attempts at relationships, I never found someone with whom I truly connected. That changed with Ethan. He seemed to understand my insecurities, my loneliness, and in no time he became a constant presence in my days. After a few weeks of exchanging messages, we decided to meet in person. When I saw him for the first time, I couldn't help but notice how different he looked from what I had imagined. Yet there was still something about him that drew me in, something I couldn't explain. His eyes had an intense glow, but at the same time a certain sadness, a depth that intrigued me. The following months were the best of my life. We were together all the time, and Ethan seemed to be everything I had ever wanted. He was attentive, affectionate, and always willing to listen. However, there was something about him that I couldn't ignore. Small details that, at the time, I chose not to give much importance to. Things like him never talking much about his past or avoiding meeting my few friends and neighbors. He always had an excuse, a reason not to socialize, but I told myself that maybe he just needed time. Then things started to change. Ethan began receiving phone calls at odd hours and leaving the house in the middle of the night without giving much explanation. When I asked, he always had a ready excuse. A friend who needed help, a work problem that needed solving. At first I believed him, but as these outings became more frequent, I started to feel uneasy. Something inside me said there was more to it, something he was hiding, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or suspicious. One night, after he left again without explanation, I felt that something was wrong. The village, usually so calm, seemed quieter than usual. A sense of unease took hold of me, a feeling I couldn't shake off. I tried to sleep, but the thoughts about Ethan and his mysterious outings wouldn't let me rest. I knew I needed to find out what was going on, but a part of me still refused to believe that something was amiss. After all, he was Ethan, the man I had fallen in love with. How could he be hiding something from me? That was the first time I began to realize that maybe I didn't know Ethan as well as I thought. And that realization, though vague and confusing, planted the seed of fear in me. A fear that, over time, would only grow, turning into something much darker and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The days passed, and the routine that was once filled with small moments of joy began to change. Ethan, who had always been so present, became increasingly distant. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, and when I asked him what was bothering him, his answers were evasive. "Nothing to worry about," he would say, but the expression on his face told a different story. I clung to the idea that maybe he was going through something difficult at work or that it was just a phase. But over time, those justifications started to feel less convincing. The late-night outings became more frequent and the excuses weaker. He said he needed to take care of urgent problems, but never explained what kind of problems they were. When I asked if he wanted to talk about it, he would just shake his head, murmuring that everything was fine. The change wasn't just in his behavior, but also in the environment around us. The house, which once felt like a cozy refuge, began to transform. The shadows on the walls seemed longer, the dark corners deeper. There was a sense of oppression in the air, as if something invisible was pressing down on my chest whenever I was alone. Even the sound of the wind outside, blowing through the trees, seemed more ominous. I started paying more attention to the times when Ethan would leave. Always late at night, when the village was wrapped in silence, and the only sounds were the crickets and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. One night, after hearing the door softly close behind him, I decided to follow through with an idea that had been hammering in my mind for days. Find out the truth. I waited a few minutes and then followed. keeping enough distance so he wouldn't notice my presence. I trailed him to the outskirts of the village, where the lit streets gave way to poorly lit dirt roads surrounded by dense trees. He walked quickly with determined steps, and I did my best to stay quiet. Then I saw him stop in front of an old, isolated house that I had never noticed before. It was a decrepit structure with dusty windows and chipped doors, the kind of place you'd expect to see abandoned. But there Ethan acted as if it were his own home. My heart raced as he unlocked the door with a key and went inside. The lights came on, dimly illuminating the interior. I got close enough to peek through one of the side windows, hiding in the shadows. What I saw made my blood run cold. The inside of the house was a complete contrast to its exterior. It was clean, organized, but in a cold, almost clinical way. The walls were lined with dark wooden panels, and there were pieces of furniture scattered around, but what caught my attention the most were the tools. Tools hanging from hooks on the wall, neatly arranged, but in a way that made my mind jump to the worst conclusions. Pliers, saws, ropes, things I would never have associated with Ethan. My stomach churned when I heard a sound coming from inside the house. A muffled moan, followed by the creaking of metal. It was a sound that didn't belong in that house, in that village, in my world. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I had to step back to avoid panicking right there. I returned home with my heart pounding, trying to find a logical explanation, a reason that made sense of what I had just witnessed. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of Ethan in that house, surrounded by those tools, wouldn't leave my mind. I knew I couldn't confront him directly. Something told me that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple betrayal or innocent lies. Something much darker and more terrifying was unfolding before me, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the truth. But one thing was certain. My life, once so peaceful, was about to crumble in ways I could never have imagined. The days that followed that discovery were marked by a growing tension. The house I once called home now felt like a trap, a place where every corner hid secrets I wasn't ready to face. I tried to act normal, pretending I didn't know anything, but inside the anxiety was eating me alive. Ethan, however, didn't seem to notice my change in behavior. Or perhaps he was so absorbed in his own secrets that he didn't care. Every time he went out at night, I was tempted to follow him again, but the fear of being caught paralyzed me. Instead, I started going through his things when he wasn't around, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what I had seen in that house. However, he was careful, meticulous even. There was nothing that suggested anything out of the ordinary. No evidence of his nocturnal activities. No hint of the dark side I had begun to fear. The nights grew longer and my sleep became increasingly disturbed. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, with the sound of muffled moans still echoing in my head. I started feeling like something or someone was watching me even when I was alone. The shadows in the corners of the house seemed to move, and the air, always cold, carried a smell I couldn't identify, something metallic and unpleasant. I decided that I couldn't live with this uncertainty any longer. I needed to know what was happening in that house, even if it meant confronting the truth I so deeply feared. One night, when Ethan left again, I resolved to go beyond just watching. I waited a few minutes and, with my heart pounding, went to the house where he was hiding. This time, I wouldn't limit myself to peeking through the windows. The door was unlocked, which gave me a strange feeling, as if he were expecting someone, perhaps me. I entered silently, the strong metallic smell hitting me immediately. The dim lighting from the old bulbs created dancing shadows on the walls, heightening the sense of dread. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the distant sound of water dripping somewhere far away. I walked down the narrow hallway until I found a partially open door, from which a faint light emanated. Behind it I heard muffled noises, voices, moans. My stomach churned, but I kept going, driven by a morbid curiosity and a fear I could no longer ignore. When I opened the door, the sight that awaited me made me gasp. The room was large but sterile, with walls covered in metal panels and the floor lined with transparent plastic, stained with what looked like blood. In the center was a metal chair with shackles on the arms and legs and a figure tied to it. It was a woman, her face covered by a leather mask, her terrified eyes fixed on me. Her clothes were torn and cuts covered her skin. She tried to move when she saw me, but the chains creaked, holding her firmly in place. Panic took hold of me. I stepped back, but something behind me blocked the exit. Ethan was there, standing in the doorway, watching me with an expression I had never seen before. His eyes, once so gentle, were now filled with a coldness that froze me to the bone. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist, Sarah," he said calmly, as if we were discussing something trivial, not a horrifying scene of torture. "You've always been too curious." I tried to mumble something, but the words died in my throat. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to escape this hellish situation, but every escape route seemed blocked by Ethan's menacing presence. I didn't mean to," I began to say, but he cut me off, stepping closer, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the room. "You don't need to apologize. In fact, I was waiting for this. I needed you to see, to understand who I really am." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an undertone of madness that made me feel sick. He took one of the tools hanging on the wall, a long, sharp knife, and began to twirl it in his hands as if it were a toy. I couldn't look away, every muscle in my body paralyzed by terror. The woman in the chair tried to scream, but the sound came out muffled and desperate, cutting through the heavy silence. Ethan moved closer, leaning in to whisper in my ear. "You're part of this now, Sarah. And there's no turning back." A shiver ran down my spine. I was trapped in the web of a maniac, and the realization of that truth was like a final blow that left me breathless. Ethan wasn't just a liar. He wasn't just a man with dark secrets. He was a predator, and I, unknowingly, had become the perfect prey. My legs were trembling, the ground seemed to be giving way beneath my feet. The knife in Ethan's hand glinted under the dim light, each of his movements meticulously calculated, as if he was about to execute a carefully planned ritual. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body was paralyzed, trapped between fear and disbelief. "Ethan, please, we can work this out," I managed to stammer, trying to sound calm, but my voice trembled as much as my hands. He just laughed, a low, cutting sound that made my stomach churn. "Work this out? Sarah, you still don't understand, do you?" He stepped away from me, slowly walking around the room, running the tip of the knife over the stained plastic on the floor. "This isn't something you work out. This is who I am. Who I've always been." His voice was like venom, each word laced with a coldness that hit me like a blade. I knew I had to get out of there, but every movement seemed impossible. The woman tied to the chair groaned again, a sound that yanked me back to the brutal reality of the situation. She was still alive, still conscious, and every passing second could be the last for both of us. "Why her, Ethan? Why do you do this?" I asked, desperate for anything that could buy time, anything that could distract him from me and that woman, even if only for a few minutes. He suddenly stopped and looked directly into my eyes, as if deciding whether or not I deserved an answer. "Why not? Have you ever wondered what really makes someone like me? It's not a choice, it's a need. Seeing the suffering, feeling the fear. It's an adrenaline rush, something no one who hasn't experienced it could ever understand." I felt a knot form in my stomach. He wasn't just torturing these people. He was reveling in it. And now, by bringing me into this world, he wanted me to partake in this sick pleasure, to share in this macabre need. The thought made me gag in horror. But then something inside me snapped. A spark of survival that overpowered the fear. I wouldn't be dragged into his madness. I had to think of a way to escape, to save that woman and get out of this hell. "I think I understand," I lied, taking a hesitant step toward him, feigning curiosity. "I always knew there was something different about you, Ethan. Something powerful. But I never imagined it was this. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." His eyebrows raised, surprised by the change in my tone. He stood still, assessing my words. The flattery, as forced as it was, seemed to stroke his ego, something I hoped I could use to my advantage. "You think so?" He moved closer, the knife still slowly spinning in his hand. Maybe you're smarter than I thought. I felt sweat trickling down my forehead, but I kept my expression steady. I needed to convince him I was on his side at least long enough to create an opening, a chance to escape. Every second counted. I just need to understand better. Show me, Ethan. Show me how you do it. Teach me to see the world as you see it. The words left my mouth like poison, but I forced them out, knowing this might be my only chance. He stopped again, this time right next to me, so close I could smell the metal on the blade. His eyes, those eyes that once drew me in, were now cold, lifeless voids. You want to learn? He asked, almost in a whisper. I swallowed hard and nodded, hoping he wouldn't detect the falseness in my voice. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes probing mine for any lie. Finally he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Then I'll show you. He handed me the knife, holding it in a way that his fingers brushed against mine for a brief moment, the contact cold and repulsive. My fingers trembled as I gripped the handle, but I forced a steady look, holding the knife firmly. Now, he said, leaning close to my ear, make her understand that there's no more hope. I wanted to vomit, to scream, but every survival instinct told me to keep pretending. Slowly, I turned to the woman in the chair, her eyes pleading for help. Every fiber of my being wanted to free her and run far away from there, but Ethan's presence behind me was a constant threat. He was close, too close, and I knew any suspicious move would make me his next victim. I approached the woman, still holding the knife. She sobbed quietly, the sound tearing at my heart. My body was on autopilot, moving as if it had accepted the role Ethan wanted me to play. The blade was near her skin, but I knew I didn't want to, do what he was expecting. Then something clicked in my mind. If I couldn't deceive him, maybe I could use his proximity to my advantage. I was close enough to Ethan and he wasn't on guard. It was my only chance. With a swift motion, I turned the knife and aimed it at him. Shock flashed across Ethan's face for a split second, but it was enough. The blade slashed his arm as he tried to pull away, blood spurting and staining the floor. I didn't hesitate. I shoved him hard, making him stumble backward. Wasting no time, I rushed to untie the woman, my hands trembling so much I could barely undo the restraints. She was weak but still had enough strength to stand with my help. Together we ran for the door, but I knew Ethan wasn't far behind. He screamed in rage, an inhuman sound that echoed through the house. I could hear him getting up behind us and my heart raced. There wasn't time. We had to get out before he caught up to us. When we finally burst through the front door, the cool night air hit me like a wave of relief, but the panic was still there. We ran as fast as we could down the dirt road, leaving that nightmare behind. The sound of Ethan's footsteps echoed in the distance, but grew fainter with each step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All that mattered was escaping, surviving, and making sure that monster paid for what he had done. We ran as if hell itself were on our heels. The dirt road seemed to stretch infinitely before us, each step a desperate effort to get away from that place of horrors. The sound of Ethan's footsteps behind us was fading, but the fear persisted, pulsing through my veins like poison. I knew we weren't safe, that he wouldn't give up easily. Finally, the small village appeared in sight, its few lights like a beacon of hope in the darkness. We were exhausted, but we couldn't stop. I held the woman's arm firmly beside me, helping her keep pace. Her legs were weak, her knees buckling with every step, but the will to survive drove her forward. When we reached the first houses, I knocked on every door I saw, screaming for help. Lights flicked on and sleepy, concerned faces began to appear in the windows. Most people hesitated, not understanding the urgency in our voices, but an elderly woman with a stern expression was the first to open the door. "Please, he's after us," I shouted, pushing the woman inside the lady's house. "Call the police." The lady didn't ask questions. As soon as she saw us, her expression hardened, and she quickly pulled us inside, locking the door behind us. She picked up the phone and started dialing, her voice firm as she reported what was happening. Relief began to seep into my body, but I knew it wasn't over yet. Ethan was out there, and if I learned anything that night, it was that he didn't give up easily. The sound of distant sirens began to cut through the night's silence, gradually growing louder until several police cars stopped outside the house. The officers quickly entered, their expressions grim when they saw us. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in pieces, my mind still in a state of shock. They led us outside to the safety of the patrol cars while a larger team advanced toward Ethan's house. Amid the confusion, I saw the woman I had saved being taken to an ambulance, her eyes still wide with fear, but now there was a spark of hope. I tried to reach her, but I was restrained by one of the officers, who insisted that I be taken to the hospital for treatment. As I was being placed in the ambulance, something strange caught my attention. On the horizon near the path leading to Ethan's house, I saw something moving. My heart skipped a beat in fear. It was Ethan, slowly walking toward the village lights. He was covered in blood, but his expression was calm, almost serene. The officers spotted him at the same time, pointing their guns, ordering him to stop. But he just smiled, a disturbing smile that made the air around me go cold. "It's too late," he murmured, audible only to those closest. Before anyone could react, he pulled something from his pocket, a small golden key, and threw it on the ground as if it were a final gesture of surrender. Confusion took over the scene, but what happened next was even more inexplicable. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, a deep, muffled sound echoing throughout the area. Suddenly, the house where he had committed his crimes in the distance exploded into a ball of flames. The flames shot violently into the sky, illuminating the night like a demonic beacon. The force of the explosion was so intense that we felt the heat even miles away. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. I saw the officers drop to the ground, shielding their heads, while the fire consumed everything around the house. Ethan didn't move, standing there, motionless, as if he were at peace with the destruction he had caused. But the strangest thing was that, at the exact moment the house was consumed by flames, Ethan fell to his knees as if his life force was tied to that place. His face, once marked by madness and cruelty, was now calm, almost relieved. He whispered something I could barely hear, but it seemed like a sort of farewell and acceptance of fate. Before anyone could reach him, Ethan simply collapsed to the ground, the life draining from his eyes. He was dead as abruptly as everything had begun. The flames continued to consume the wreckage in the distance, but where he lay, only silence remained. I stood there in shock as chaos unfolded around me. Police officers ran to try to understand what had happened, but all I could think about was Ethan's final smile and the key he had dropped. A key now lost among the wreckage, along with all the dark secrets it locked away. Months passed, and the story of the house and the maniac in the Florida backwoods made headlines across the country. The investigations uncovered numerous atrocities, but what really happened that night, what truly triggered the explosion and Ethan's collapse, remained a mystery. I tried to move on, but the memory of those cold eyes and that macabre smile never left me. There was something more in that house, something beyond human understanding. And now, as I look at the key I found in my pocket weeks later, a key identical to the one Ethan held, I can't help but think that the true horror isn't over. The nightmare continues, somewhere waiting patiently to be discovered again.